I hate clean air and water. I don't care how much companies pollute rivers and streams. I don't even like trees. I just care about tax cuts.
True! Hey there, everyone. I didn't know we were recording today. Welcome back. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another thrilling episode of PragerU. You've got to be kidding me. The rules of this game show are simple. While the video title and thumbnail that you just clicked on make it obvious what this video is about to be about, at time of recording, I have no clue what's about to happen. And that's because, for today's video, I'm going to leave the topic up to the unwieldy goddess that is chance. You see this dartboard over here? Each of the numbers on this dartboard are assigned to a different PragerU video. I'm going to throw darts at this boardy boo and then react to whichever video it lands on. Make sense? Come on, spit it out. Does it make sense? Good. Okay, let's get on with it. Gotta get myself psyched. Gotta get my head in the game. Woo! Here we go. Oh. I mean, I've never had it hit on the first throw. Is that legal? Is that legal for that to happen? Well, folks, the darts have spoken, which means today's video will be on conservatives are the real environmentalists. Jesus, this is gonna be a treat. I'm excited, y'all. I hope y'all are too. So with that out of the way, let's turn it on over to Reaction Room, Piley. Take it away, dude. Thanks, Dartboard Piley. So yeah, the subject of today's video is gonna be Conservatives Are the Real Environmentalists, hosted by none other than our favorite professional wrong person, Michael Knowles.
I hate clean air and water. I don't care how much companies pollute rivers and streams. I don't even like trees. I just care about tax cuts.
True! Just to be crystal clear, this motherfucker already thinks we too strictly regulate the environment, even after all of the deregulation Trump brought in that allowed more leeways for destruction from companies. He thinks that's too much. Just keep that in mind as we go forward.
In fact, the whole idea of national parks was created by a Republican, Ulysses Grant. The park system was greatly expanded by another Republican, Teddy Roosevelt.
What I find really interesting here is the fact that the video is called Conservatives Are the Real Environmentalists. Yet here he feels the need to gesture to the party they're from so that you will make the false assumption that his values represent the current Republican Party. Whereas if you look at another video I made a few weeks ago responding to a PragerU video, you'll know that party policies switch over time. And in fact, Teddy Roosevelt is this weird enigma in the Republican Party of that time. Teddy's progressive or populist-esque policies, like trust-busting, federal involvement in conservation, and some increased tax proposals, went against the grain of the Republican Party. Members of his own party criticized him at the time. My favorite odd little example being this really on-the-nose political cartoon, which remarks that he's basically a Democrat because he campaigned on federal land control and increased taxes. So it's really odd to point to Teddy as some conservative hero when he probably wouldn't have been considered one by actual conservatives of his time. And even by today's standards, in a lot of ways, he more closely maps onto progressives or populists than your run-of-the-mill Republican. Except for racism against Native Americans, him and some modern Republicans seem to be in lockstep on that one.
We birthed a nation from nothing. I mean, there was nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, that.
But more generally, I want to draw attention to the way that conservatives are the real environmentalists shifts to Republicans are the real environmentalists when it services them to gesture to people who are technically in their party who probably don't align with their current values.
And the Environmental Protection Agency was, yes, established by a Republican, Richard Nixon.
Whatever you folks do, do not look into Ronald Reagan's history with the environment. You know, the president right after Nixon. There, nothing to see here, nothing to see, folks. Just look away. Also, it's really funny, and by funny I of course mean blatantly hypocritical, to give Nixon credit for the EPA in one breath and then praise every Republican who weakened the EPA's powers later on. Like, is federal involvement good or bad, Michael? I can't tell. You're giving me mixed signals, guy.
Conservatives want to conserve things. It's right there in the name.
Okay, that... This is some of the dumbest logic. Conserve is in the name conservative. When you make the same shitty argument as this satirical TPUSA meme, you know you done fucked up. Also, now is as good a time as any to say that if conservatives are conservationists because conserve is in their name, then North Korea must be a strong democracy because it has democratic in the name. That's just sound logic right there. There's no undoing my rhetorical prowess. Get wrecked, nerd. But that's just a technicality. More to the point, if you were in favor of conserving the environment, you would not have videos on your channel like PragerU happens to about why carbon emissions are good, actually, and you would not be constantly deregulating so that the environment can be destroyed. If you really cared to conserve it, you'd be doing, I think, quite the opposite.
Safer, more efficient power, nuclear, geothermal, biomass.
Notice how none of that just so happens to be, solar or wind for some reason. It all just conveniently is the few things that his donors, the ones who fund Prager University, happen to have investments in.
To the extent that government gets involved in conservation, say protecting wildlife, it should get involved at the most local level possible.
While I generally agree that more localized forms of government are preferable, what he just so happens to be conveniently ignoring here is the power dynamic that gets thrown out of whack when you take the regulation away from the federal and put it into the local. By that I mean a city or county government has much less literal power or financial power to properly assert themselves against like a giant oil firm. So while I in theory agree that localized government is more neat and based, the push to localize regulation in the context of an oil and fracking baron funded political channel cannot be divorced from the long-term political campaign to get the strength of the federal government off the back of these large companies so they can pursue profits at the expense of whatever things the federal government was regulating.
So how can we tell which way works best? Let's examine the historical record. Today, and for the last century, the worst environmental offenders have been big, repressive, socialist governments.
I was skeptical of this claim the moment it cursed my ears. I intuitively figured that Europe and America were the worst carbon emitters, considering we industrialized first, and our industrialization was through dirtier, much worse forms of carbon emission. And it turns out all I needed to prove my initial assumption was one of his sources. In this Forbes article we see, since 1965, the US has produced the most CO2, not some big Eastern Bloc socialist government. So maybe Michael and Dennis should actually read the articles they cite. They might learn a thing or two.
China, for example, pumps roughly twice as much carbon into the air each year as the United States.
It is really shitty and yet a further extension of the history of imperialism for Western nations to spend the first century of industrialization just pumping the worst kind of shit into the air, to then turn around while they are still massively contributing to the problem and say to developing nations, well, you good sir are just being real dirty here. Ignore the fact that we're trying to deregulate so we can be even dirtier, but you, sir, what a disgusting display. Because while I don't like more carbon being pumped into the atmosphere no matter where it comes from, it is kind of shitty to gatekeep and shame developing nations for the same processes we've been engaging in for over a century and a half. But more to the point here, there's a lot more people in China. In fact, let's do the math here. So yeah, if you take the population of China and the population of the United States, there's about 4.25 times more people in China than in the US. If we go back to the video, he says they have about twice the emissions as us. Now, I can't find this statistic in the cited Forbes article, So let's just assume for a second that the number is a flat 2, even though that wording makes me think it's closer to like 1.9 or something. So we see that per capita, we actually end up producing twice the amount of carbon emissions as China. He tries to compound this discrepancy by saying our economy is almost 60% bigger. But when you look at the cited Forbes article, I don't see any data to suggest that our economy is that precise number larger than China's. But regardless, let's even assume for a second that his figure here is correct. Even if we account for the different size in the economy, which would be a rate of 1.6, we're still producing about a third more carbon per capita controlled for sizes of our economy than China. So his argument blatantly ignores scale for the purposes, of course, of shifting blame onto a developing nation. Which isn't even to get into the fact that a lot of the emissions China is producing are emissions that we've basically just offshored. Like, a lot of this is just going to make fucking Funko Pops and knockoff Nikes and shit, you know? Like, even if we're not directly producing it, we are partially responsible because our consumer demand for those products is driving these emissions.
When President Trump announced his intention to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, environmentalists warned of imminent disaster. Yet a year later, it turned out that the United States led the world in reducing carbon emissions. It did so without surrendering its national sovereignty.
Really weird to frame the very light, very doesn't hold anyone to account Paris Climate Accord as a threat to national sovereignty. But more than anything, it's really interesting how he tries to frame these as related. Like, the fact that we might have led the world in reduced carbon emissions that year was rather than the result of decades of environmental activism and policies pushed by those groups. It was instead this one singular decision to leave the Paris Climate Accord. Or moreover, he's making the really lazy argument that because leaving the Paris Climate Accord didn't kill us all immediately, it was therefore hyperbolic to say it might have caused problems, which also isn't a good argument.
Moreover, Canada, the EU, and China, all signatories to the Paris Accord, not only failed to live up to their commitments, but increased their annual carbon emissions.
That is the fault of the Climate Accord itself being, again, to borrow a phrase from these people's camps a little bit, more so just a virtue signal than any sort of hardline commitments. So, like, to say that that's a problem with the idea of a more wide-reaching international goal is really bizarre. Like, it's the fact that the Accord was toothless, not the fact that it existed, that related to their increased emissions.
In contrast, conservatives are all about innovating our way to a cleaner environment.
Bro, if the market was ever going to respond and save us, it would have responded years ago. Like, we've known for over 40 years now that shit was going wrong, yet we're still in this shit position because in the market, those that garnished the most power used that power to keep enforcing the use of this commodity because, believe it or not, when oil starts to become rarer, it starts to become more profitable for businesses. Whereas with an infinite resource like wind or solar, it's harder to monetize that because the thing that supplies the energy is not controlled. You know, there's no scarcity that could be forced, and there's no real way for people in the market to dominate access to that. So clean energy doesn't really mesh with market forces. And by the way, that's not clean energy's problem, that's the fucking market's problem. Therefore, not only is there the entrenched power of oil barons getting in the way of a clean environment, but the profit motive itself kind of incentivizes people to hold on for this until there's basically none of it. And it's not that Marxist-Leninist Obama got in the way of that happening. It's the fact that the market is proving it struggles to respond to a situation like this until it's absolutely last-minute necessary.
The left demonizes fracking even though it actually makes the environment cleaner. How does it make the environment cleaner? By releasing up to 50% less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than coal.
Just because it releases a little bit less doesn't make it preferable to true renewable resources like wind and solar. But again, market forces don't quite gel with those as much. It is much more profitable to pursue an industry with a finite controllable resource like natural gas. Therefore, that's where the market's going. Even though it still emits, I don't care if it's a little bit less. We're just slowing down the rate at which we're going to destroy everything if we start using slightly less harmful finite resources. But of course, that's a little bit too much to ask of oil billionaires, the channel. So yeah, that's a wrap on his video, folks. And as we wrap up here, you might have noticed one glaring omission from his video. Despite claiming to care about the environment, Michael Knowles doesn't bring up climate change once. He doesn't mention rising temperatures or sea levels, or how drastic our actions need to be to fix things before it's too late. Rather, he talks about environmentalism as this really low-stakes affair, like that the only thing we need to do is get some garbage out of a local wetland. Keep in mind, this is the same channel that, as we saw a few weeks ago, tried to reduce climate change concerns to worrying about a few polar bears dying. And it makes sense why Michael Knowles and Prager University as a channel would try to frame environmentalism as this insignificant little incremental affair, because if they talked about environmentalism with the proper life or death stakes in mind, his free-form, live and let live market approach to the problem would seem delusional, which, to be clear, it is. Now you might be asking, why doesn't his solution work? As we discussed earlier, the profit motive tends to favor products that have a clear path to constant monetization. It's part of the reason Tesla's coil was dumped and why electric cars didn't pick up sooner. Investors were worried they couldn't nickel and dime the shit out of their customers in those markets, so they sided with sectors where monetization was easier. And we see these market forces carry over to today. When you sell somebody a roof of solar panels, they become largely self-sufficient, a thought which strikes fear in the heart of every business person. Whereas sticking to a finite resource means those who harvest the resource and control where it goes at which price have a lot of power. Plus, businesses mostly operate in a short-term, quarter-by-quarter basis. Even though renewables are the long-term cheaper solution on top of the preferable environmental one, any power company that tries to implement the technology will be met with massive upfront costs, meaning they'll quickly fall behind their competitors who are able to offer cheaper goods. For that reason, companies often don't take the helpful long-term steps so they can preserve their quarterly profits. Translation, it'll take forever to implement renewable energy because it has to be more profitable before large-scale changes happen. So Michael's precious market forces impede necessary changes quite a bit. And since it seems impossible for us to escape the commodity form in any meaningful way anytime soon, the solution ends up being to funnel so much money into renewable technology that it just can't help but be the cheaper option. Maybe if we had more time, we could pontificate about smaller scale changes, but because the people that fund this channel have spent decades making sure that those minor changes don't happen, we kind of have to take large-scale action. I mean, I guess we could go full Ann Prim to stop emitting so much carbon, but no one's ready for that conversation yet. But yeah, that's about all I have to say, so let's turn it on over to End Screen Piley. Take it away, End Screen Piley. Thanks, Reaction Room Piley, and thank you for watching, lovely viewer. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to toss me a like and subscribe down below, but if you really want to support me, you can join me over on Patreon. Patrons get access to exclusive content, like early versions of every video essay, behind-the-scenes content, and Patreon-exclusive videos. So be sure to join me on Patreon if you want access to all those extra little goodies. Speaking of patrons, I want to give the biggest of thank yous to Piley Benton's biggest boys, like Nilic Elites, Sean Locke, Floof Pants, and Kerman Ferd. If you want to have your name read off at the end of every video, be sure to join me on this specific tier. Thanks much, everyone, and I'll see you next time.